Good afternoon and welcome to the September 2012 Senior Management Team meeting. I have circulated a paper prior to the meeting detailing further redundancies in all departments. You will have noted that there will also be a further wage freeze for 2 years for all staff. We are truly experiencing very difficult times.
Tony, are you seriously expecting us to have further redundancies and a further wage freeze?
Unfortunately, yes I do. We simply have no choice.
Reality is starting to dawn on Western economies.
Is that so? Okay, how come the US have experienced growth, whilst we in the UK are in recession? We should follow the US model.
Okay, Steve, I shall try and explain the problem to you. But before I do, what do you think the US have been doing?
Growing the economy.
Okay, how was that achieved?
By spending money, which in turn produced growth.
And where did the money come from?
From the banks.
Where do the banks get their money from?
From our savings.
Steve, do you remember the presentations given by Charles and Jennifer?
Yes, we have had quite a few of them.
In that case, what was so special about 1971?
That's the year Richard Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard.
That's correct. It was only supposed to be a temporary measure, but the dollar was never returned to the gold standard.
That's when our problems in the Western economies really started to get much worse. I have to admit that the gold standard had its problems. It did not eliminate boom and busts, but it made them more manageable. Following 1971, the dollar became a fiat currency, in other words, backed by nothing.
I cannot see the problem. Okay, we are going through a recession, but it will end soon. They always do.
Tracy, you are suffering from normalcy bias. In other words, the experiences you have had in the past, you expect to continue in the future.
George is correct. That's why too many people will not be prepared for the paradigm shift ahead.
The paradigm shift is already taking place in Greece. The poverty is dreadful. My family are in a terrible position. I am doing my best to help them out financially.
I don't think matters in the UK will get that bad.
Steve, if you think matters will not get that bad, I would suggest that you have no idea how a monetary system works.
Okay, let's do some role play. Steve, let's assume that you are the US, and Sue, let's assume that you are the UK. Steve, as the US, you currently have a debt ceiling of $16.4 trillion, and by the way, that excluded unfunded liabilities. You have just broken through $16 trillion of debt and it is getting closer to the debt ceiling. What are you going to do?
I would increase the debt ceiling to promote growth.
Could you put your hands up if you think increasing the debt ceiling would promote growth? Okay, we all agree that raising the debt ceiling would promote some growth. Steve, where is the money going to come from to raise the debt ceiling?
We can borrow from the bond market.
Recently, the US have been unable to raise enough funds on the open market and therefore the Federal Reserve Bank have had to buy up the bonds.
Steve, does it not worry you that the US run a deficit year by year?
Not at all. When there is a boom, it can be paid back.
Where exactly will the demand come from to sustain a boom?
From the US population.
Steve, the average US person has a lot of personal debt. There simply won't be the demand for high consumer spending. The US government also have far too much debt, and when you factor the unfunded liabilities, it's an absolute nightmare. The problem is that the debt-based fractional reserve banking fiat monetary system was a vehicle that allowed too much money to be borrowed from the future. The lifestyle we have lived over the last 40 years or so is unsustainable.
We can continue with quantitative easing. In fact, QE3 was announced yesterday. That will ensure that the markets will rally. It will also help job growth.
I agree that the stock markets will rise and that there will be some growth. But here is the rub. The growth will be very small compared to the vast sums of money pumped into the economy.
Tony is spot on with his assessment. Steve, the average US person has far less spending power these days. The debasement of the money supply has meant that a larger proportion of their salary is spent on fuel and food. In a nutshell, as the dollar is debased, commodities rise relative to it.
That's right. And what you have to remember is that the interest on our borrowing over the years become a higher percentage of our repayments. So you see, in the long run, a major depression is a certainty. QE only delays the inevitable. Indeed, QE will ensure a greater collapse. Okay, Sue, over to you. We have assumed that you are the UK and you have implemented austerity measures to try and reduce the debt. Do you think that course of action will be successful?
I don't think it will be successful, but it is the lesser of two evils. At least with commencing an austerity drive, there is an attempt to deal with reality. The bottom line, and I agree with you, Tony, on this, is that a tipping point was passed many years ago. We simply cannot avoid a major depression. The austerity drive will ensure that the debt does not balloon out of control, but here is the rub. Growth cannot be achieved with an austerity drive. We will suffer the paradox of thrift. A deflationary spiral will happen, and that's when further QE will be applied. Further QE will debase our currency and will cause price inflation.
Sue, you have hit the nail on the head, and that's the reality. No matter what path we take, a major depression will happen. We have also got to remember that the unfunded liabilities can never be properly funded. It's a Ponzi scheme. It relies on future generations to fund it. Unfortunately, there are not enough younger people to support the baby boomers that are retiring. A new reality will dawn. People will eventually realize that the spending spree is over. The next generation will have to get used to being poorer. They will have to compete globally for their jobs and adapt to worsening pay and conditions. Okay, this leads me into the agenda item regarding staff redundancies and pay freeze.